In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We have two interesting characters that have come to us in the readings today, Moses and Peter. I'll start with Moses. Moses was this huge figure in the Old Testament, but had a very unique life that led up to his important role. We heard several weeks ago the beginning of Moses' life, how the Pharaoh had decreed that all Hebrew babies who were male should be killed, but that his mother had kept him alive by putting him in a basket and seeing to it that the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, would find him and ended up adopting him. And so Moses was not raised as a Hebrew slave, he was raised as a prince in Egypt. But he did know where he came from. It was his sister Miriam who saw to it that the princess found him. And it was Miriam who arranged that Moses' own mother served as his wet nurse as a baby. He knew his family. He knew his roots. It was because of this dissonance in his life that his family and his people were slaves, and yet he lived this life of a prince that was difficult for him. And one day he saw an Egyptian slave master who was beating and mistreating a Hebrew slave, and he lost his temper, and he killed that Egyptian slave master. And of course, when that happened, everything came crashing down on him. This realization of, I may be an adopted son, but I'm still a Hebrew, and they're going to arrest me, and they're going to kill me. And he ran. He ran across the Red Sea to the Sinai Peninsula and there lived with the Midianites. Lived with them for a long time, ended up marrying the daughter of the priest/chief of the Midianites, a man named Jethro. He married his daughter, a woman named Zipporah, and had at least one son. And where the story picked up today, Joseph was working for his father-in-law, tending his sheep, and he was at what would later be known as the mountain of God, in this story called Horeb, in other stories called Sinai. And there on the mountain he saw that amazing sight of a bush that was on fire but wasn't burning. It wasn't burning up. And when he turned aside to look at the sight, he met God. And God called to him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And he goes on to talk about how he has observed the misery of Moses' people, the Hebrews, and that he was now calling Moses to be the key figure in getting the Israelites out of slavery and out of Egypt, and to take them to this new land, this land which has such a wonderful description, a land flowing, a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey, the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. This was Canaan, which we now know today as Palestine or Israel. This was Moses' task, to lead his people out. How did Moses respond to that? Who, me? I can't do that. He says, this requires, I'm not a very good speaker. I can't do this. Who am I going to say, send me? They're not going to believe me. This was all the sort of thing that Moses was doing. We heard in here, he asked, who do I even say? To which God responded the famous, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. And then gave them God's name that we now consider too holy to pronounce. It's you heard it. Thus shall you say to the Israelites, the Lord. And then actually in the Hebrew it is YHWH, the name of God, probably pronounced Yahweh. The God of your ancestors. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. So in all of that, Moses was given authority. If we'd kept reading, we'd have found out that he continued to argue that he just wasn't good enough. at which point God said, all right, I'm going to send your brother Aaron with you. He's going to help you talk. Now, the funny thing about all of this with Moses is that there was no one who was better prepared and more gifted to lead the people out of Egypt than he was. He'd been raised as an Egyptian prince. He was fluent in their language. He knew the people. He understood how their politics worked. There was actually no one better than Moses, and yet Moses didn't think he was adequate or worthy. But God called him anyway. Now let's look at Peter. Peter, if you remember last week, had one of his high points in his career, his whole experience with Jesus. When they were way out in the desert and Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" And people were naming off prophets and the like. And Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And it was Peter who said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Yes, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And now I'm going to give you this nickname, Peter, Kepha, and on this rock I will build my church." An amazing, wonderful experience for Peter. Which gets us to today's reading of how it turned so quickly. Jesus then began to explain to everyone, including Peter, what it meant to be the Messiah. That in fact, he was not going to ascend to the throne of David and his group of people become, the cabinet and prime minister and the like, but rather he was going to suffer and be beaten and killed, and on the third day rise again. You could just see, in a way, as the story is telling, that Peter's mind is just spinning. Wait, that's not how the story goes, he's thinking. No, you're supposed to be the king. You're not supposed to die. And he gets up. It's translated, "God forbid it." Actually, what he says is, "Mercy on you, Lord. This must never happen." And instead of Jesus saying, "Oh, thank you, Peter, I appreciate your concern," Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your minds on human things, not divine things." And he called Peter a stumbling block. In Greek, scandalon, from which we get the word in English, scandal. And it is literally a stumbling block, something you trip over and fall. How could Peter have gone from, "Hey, you got it right," to "you could not be more wrong"? Well, as we learned in hearing the story about Peter, that's kind of an ongoing thing with him. It's one of the theories of the Gospels is that Mark's Gospel was written by John Mark, but it was the memories of Peter that John Mark had ended up as Peter's corresponding secretary towards the end of his life. You can almost picture Peter and Mark sitting down over dinner and Peter saying to Mark, "Let me tell you about another time I did something really stupid." Because that's kind of how the story plays out. But remember with Peter, it didn't end there. That wasn't his last goof. The night before Jesus died and Jesus was talking about what was about to happen and that people would deny him, and Peter says, "Oh no, not me. I'll never deny you." And Jesus had to say, "No, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And as it turned out, he did. Denied ever even knowing Jesus or who he was. However, there was redemption. If you remember, John in his gospel provides the counterpoint to Peter's denial, where on the Sea of Galilee, after the risen Jesus appears to them and they catch so many fish they can barely bring them ashore, and Jesus draws Peter aside and 3 times says to him, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, of course, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus says, "Either tend my sheep or feed my sheep or feed my lambs," to each of the 3 times. So 3 times Peter denied, 3 times Peter claimed to love Jesus. And what was the upshot of it? Jesus was still calling Peter to serve in ministry. Tend my sheep, feed my lambs. There probably couldn't be anybody who had messed up enough times or as many times as Peter, and yet God still called him, and he proved to be a very great and capable leader of the church. Not because he was so great, but because a great God had called him to ministry. Our great God. Just like Moses, who was well prepared and had his doubts. With God, Moses did lead the people out of Israel from slavery into freedom. And you remember at the end of the gospel today, Jesus says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For every one of us, there's a call to ministry, just like there was a call to Moses and there was a call to Peter. But it's not a call like we're used to in the way the world works. It's not a call to fame and glory. It's a call to service, a call to empty ourselves of our own ambitions and desires and wants, and to give ourselves completely to God and God's mission. That's what he means by being willing to take up our cross and follow him. Now, fortunately, and if you remember back from last week, he doesn't literally mean a cross every time. Last week, when we heard in Romans, what just preceded our reading from Romans today, Paul writes and he says, therefore, I ask you to present yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And he goes on to say, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And he talks about the various gifts and roles that we all have in the church, and that we all do different things, but we're all serving the same God. Despite our brokenness, despite our sinfulness, despite everything, God is calling us into this ministry and is gifting us and giving us the ability to serve, just as he did for Moses, just as he did for Peter. And in what we heard today, he gives us this very positive view of what that life is like. It is impossible to translate properly into English. You heard it in English, obviously, but it doesn't really do the trick. It comes across like this: let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with mutual affection. In Greek, it's a series of participial phrases. There's never even a verb in there. It means, when we try to think about it, that these are things that we do continually, over and over again, never stopping, always there. A very literal translation would be loving what is genuine, hating what is evil, holding fast to what is good, loving one another out of mutual affection. You can see how that just goes on and on. But that's the picture of the life. This is not, when we think of taking up our cross and following Jesus, think, it's going to be awful. No, he's talking about a life devoted to doing good, a life devoted to God that has its own reward in it, already there. And yes, there may be suffering and there may be loss at times, but the reward, the intrinsic reward of following Jesus is worth more than anything. If, in fact, we are willing to take up our cross, that is, make our lives a living sacrifice to Christ, we will transform the world, and we will overcome evil with good. That's the promise to every one of us. God is calling us to this ministry, and whether we think we're worthy enough or not is of no consequence, because God is calling us anyway. Amen.